The moment Brad Preston swaggered into the Monday morning all-hands meeting, wearing his smug little smirks and swinging a laser pointer like a plastic lightsaber, I knew Nexacorp Technologies was about to receive a corporate colonoscopy from a man who had never built a single physical product in his entire 34 years on this earth. "Welcome to the new era of agile synergy," he bellowed across the auditorium, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of someone whose father knew three key members of the board of directors. "We are trimming fat, optimizing workflows, and leaning aggressively into scalable market disruption." By fat, Brad meant human beings. He meant legacy senior engineers who had spent decades in the trenches, institutional memory that could fix a crashing server with a single line of script, and the veteran developers who actually understood how our complex firmware held our flagship biometric security hardware together. By disruption, he meant burning the engine down mid-flight while praying to the venture capital gods that the falling wreckage would somehow transform into a profitable flying vehicle. Before hitting the ground, I sat in the very back row of the auditorium, sipping my lukewarm gas station coffee out of a faded ceramic mug, watching him with the detached, analytical curiosity of an experienced auto mechanic inspecting a hairline fracture on a cast iron engine block. There was no sudden surge of anger, no spike of adrenaline or panic, just that heavy, bone-deep exhaustion you feel when you have already watched this exact terrible movie 3 times before in corporate America. This was certainly not my first rodeo with some 20-something or 30-something venture capital consultant in a tailored fleece vest, trying to justify his exorbitant management fee by firing the very engineers who had designed the company's core products. But Brad did not just smell like unnecessary corporate change. He smelled like walking legal liability and overpriced body spray. Then came the specific presentation slide and the exact spoken line that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand completely straight up. Brad clicked to a high-contrast presentation slide featuring generic stock photography of silver server racks and announced, effective immediately, all legacy patents, pending utility filings, and personal R&D archives connected to Nexacorp's system architectures are placed under mandatory internal audit for corporate ownership consolidation. He did not even look in my direction when he uttered those words. He simply dropped them into the room like routine administrative housekeeping, as if 14 long years of my midnight garage experimentation, oscilloscope measurements, and firmware prototyping were merely a rounding error on his acquisition integration spreadsheet. I did not flinch, nor did I shift in my seat. In fact, I actually smiled, the slow, icy kind of smile a veteran hunter gives when a naive forest creature finally steps both feet into a hidden wire trap that had been set 3 weeks prior. Because what Brad Preston did not know, and what the high-priced corporate legal counsel firm retained by the private equity group had never bothered to audit, was buried deep inside the brittle yellowing pages of my original 2010 employment offer letter. It was sitting peacefully inside a navy blue paper folder behind a jar of dusty Altoids mints in the bottom drawer of my home filing cabinet. Paragraph 7. 7 plain lines written in exceptionally dry, unpretentious legal prose back when Nexacorp was just 5 underpaid engineers sharing a leased industrial warehouse. Back when the original founders still respected real engineering work. The clause stated with absolute clarity that any independent inventions, firmware algorithms, hardware schematics, or software codebases developed entirely outside of normal corporate operating hours, off-site, using personal financial resources and without direct corporate directive or assignment, remain the sole, exclusive, and unencumbered personal property of the employee. Nobody in human resources or corporate legal had updated that employment offer template in over 14 years. I had certainly never asked them to review or update that document, because while executive suits spent their workdays worshiping quarterly profit projections and building elaborate slide decks, I had spent hundreds of long evenings welding custom prototype chassis, wiring microcontrollers, and writing low-level C code in my garage at 2 in the morning. My home laboratory was a sanctuary of genuine innovation. I had invested tens of thousands of dollars of my own hard-earned money over the years into specialized dual-trace oscilloscopes, logic analyzers, precision soldering stations, and dedicated Linux workstations. Every single schematic design and firmware algorithm had been forged under the warm glow of desk lamps long after corporate office hours had concluded. I had built specialized circuit boards, designed low-noise power regulation circuits, and engineered proprietary encryption modules that far surpassed standard industry bench standards. Furthermore, I had not been careless. I had documented every single technical breakthrough on a secure, encrypted journaling system that automatically timestamped every single key press. I possessed high-definition video footage of initial bench tests, Git commit hashes mirrored to independent personal servers, raw component purchase receipts paid out of my personal checking account, and physical lab notebooks verified by a licensed notary public. Every single design iteration had been cataloged with extreme legal foresight. So while Brad strutted across the auditorium stage like he was Moses parting the Red Sea for the sales department, I quietly began my own comprehensive technical audit. I quietly backed up my personal encrypted storage drives. I wiped my garage whiteboard clean of sensitive architectural block diagrams. I cross-referenced every single patent filed under my personal name against the explicit wording of paragraph 7 with the meticulous precision of a seasoned federal prosecutor preparing a high-stakes corporate fraud trial. And the absolute sweetest part of the entire situation was that not a single soul in executive management noticed what I was doing. Not HR, not legal, and certainly not Brad's army of associate product managers who spent their afternoons posting inspirational quotes in their internal chat channels. The corporate layoffs began on Thursday morning with a surgical, bureaucratic coldness that only mid-level management suits can truly achieve. Two of my finest embedded systems, engineers were abruptly summoned into 15-minute calendar holds that appeared on their screens like sudden digital landmines. By Friday afternoon, 12 veteran developers, people who had dedicated their best years to building Nexacorp's hardware infrastructure from the ground up, had been escorted out of the building by private security guards who looked deeply embarrassed to perform such duties. There were no exit interviews, no severance negotiations, and not even a simple box of store-bought pastries in the break room to acknowledge more than a decade of loyal service. Brad stood near the glass atrium after the final desk had been stripped clean of personal family photos, casually holding a white cup of artisan espresso. Sometimes, he declared to the remaining terrified staff members who were huddled near the water cooler, an organization has to amputate a healthy limb so the entire corporate body can survive the financial winter. My desk phone buzzed before the heavy wrought iron parking lot gate had even finished closing behind my former lead developer's car. The automated calendar invite was short, cryptic, and blunt. Subject: Executive Restructuring Meeting with Chief Executive Officer. No body text, no agenda attached, no human resources representative copied on the message, and no explanation provided. When 3:15 p.m. rolled around on the clock, I straightened my collar and walked directly into Brad's corner office. The room smelled strongly of expensive leather polish and cedarwood cologne. Brad was lounging comfortably in a high-end ergonomic mesh chair, staring out at the hazy downtown city skyline like a conqueror assessing a newly captured territory. He motioned casually toward the low leather chair across from his glass desk without taking his eyes off his tablet screen. "Nate, thank you for making time in your afternoon schedule," he said, adopting that practiced, artificial tone of solemn corporate empathy that business school professors teach in executive management seminars. "I will get straight to the heart of the matter. Your current role as Director of Hardware Firmware Architecture is being sunsetted effective immediately." I tilted my head slightly, keeping my facial expression entirely neutral and calm. "Sunsetted," I repeated, "rather than eliminated?" He gave me a smooth, perfectly practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. "We are realigning our corporate product roadmap toward cloud-based software services and subscription models. We require much leaner engineering teams and more agile mind share across our core verticals." He reached over and slid a thick paper packet across the polished glass desk. It was pre-filled severance documentation containing 40 pages of dense legalese. I flipped directly past the boilerplate non-disclosure clauses on page 1 and went straight to page 2, scanning down until my eyes landed on section 4D. The entire paragraph was highlighted in yellow ink. Employee agrees to execute a full, total, and retroactive assignment and transfer of all intellectual property rights, pending patent applications, proprietary software algorithms, and personal design archives created during or adjacent to employment tenure. Adjacent to employment tenure. I had reviewed thousands of complex technical contracts over my long engineering career, and I recognized predatory legal phrasing the instant I saw it. That phrase was not standard corporate boilerplate. It was a desperate, sneaky net cast by corporate legal to trap the massive portfolio of independent patents that had slipped through their initial acquisition audit. My patents. The foundational system architecture that I had spent 14 years refining during my personal time, using equipment and tools that Nexacorp had never spent a single penny to acquire or maintain. I stared at the highlighted text for several quiet moments, taking in the full predatory scope of their maneuver. They wanted to strip away 14 years of proprietary firmware logic, encryption routines, and biometric sensor control schemes for a tiny lump sum severance payment. It was a complete corporate mugging disguised as routine human resources paperwork. The entire severance agreement was structured to trap unwary developers who did not understand intellectual property law. I looked up from the document, met Brad's smug gaze directly, and gave a simple, silent nod of my head. Brad completely misread my calm demeanor. He assumed I was emotionally crushed, stunned into silent submission by the sudden loss of my prestigious executive title and high-paying corporate salary. "If you choose to execute the release documents today," he said, leaning back in his chair with an unmistakable air of total victory, "human resources can expedite your lump sum severance payout by Friday. There is really no need to draw out an uncomfortable administrative process." I picked up the paper packet, folded it neatly along the seam, and placed it inside my leather briefcase. "I will give this paperwork a very thorough review tonight at home," I said softly. He grinned like a man who believed he had just successfully closed the easiest contract negotiation of his career. "No hard feelings whatsoever, Nate. You were a very important part of our early company story. We simply required different characters for the next corporate chapter." I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and looked him straight in the eyes. "Do not worry about me, Brad. I am still writing the book. When I arrived home that evening, I did not throw things, scream in frustration, or punch a hole in the drywall. I calmly poured 2 fingers of aged rye whiskey, sat down on the hardwood floor of my home study, and unlocked my heavy steel filing cabinet. Key in hand, I slid open the bottom drawer and retrieved the thick navy blue folder labeled Original Employment Agreement 2010. I pulled out my phone, snapped a perfectly lit photograph of paragraph 7, and instantly transmitted it to Eleanor Vance, my attorney and cousin. Eleanor was barely 5 feet tall, drank her morning coffee jet black, and had once forced a notorious venture capitalist to break down during a formal court deposition merely by reading his own conflicting press releases back to him line by line. I attached 3 simple words beneath the photograph. "It is time." 45 seconds later, Eleanor's reply flashed across my phone screen. "Bring the original signed folder and all encrypted storage drives to my law office at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." Eleanor did not utter a single word for the first 20 minutes of our morning meeting. She sat behind her massive mahogany desk, her wire-rimmed reading glasses perched low on the bridge of her nose, meticulously comparing my original 2010 offer letter against the statutory language of California Labor Code. Section 2870, and Title 35 of the United States. Code Section 271. She gently tapped her gold fountain pen against the dark blue paper of paragraph 7, a faint, razor-sharp smile appearing at the corner of her lips. "This is exceptionally clean work, Nate," she remarked, her voice dry, precise, and completely devoid of wasted emotion. The founding partners wrote an ironclad independent invention carve-out clause back when the company was vulnerable and desperate to attract top-tier engineering talent away from major tech giants. And then their corporate acquisition lawyers, completely forgot to audit or update those agreements when the private equity group bought them out 4 years ago. Do they actually understand what they signed back then? I asked. Taking a chair across from my trusted attorney, Eleanor chuckled dryly, taking a measured sip from her black coffee mug. Large corporate legal teams at companies like Nexacorp operate entirely on intimidation, speed, and volume. They fire senior staff members suddenly, present them with a seemingly large severance check, and rely on the employee being far too frightened of missing mortgage payments to actually read Section 4D. They simply assume 99% of people will sign the blanket release without asking questions. I reached inside my heavy winter coat and placed a solid silver encrypted USB drive on the desk between us. This drive contains 14 full years of time-stamped commit logs, detailed hardware schematics, firmware repositories, and third-party cryptographic hashes. Every single prototype build was executed on my personal Linux workstation in my garage, paid for out of my personal checking account, completely outside of my contractual 40-hour work week. Eleanor picked up the metal drive, inspecting its weight like a seasoned prosecutor examining key evidence in a criminal proceeding. Have you ever connected these storage drives to Nexacorp networks or used company-issued laptops to compile any of this code? Never, I stated firmly. I went so far as to install a completely separate fiber optic internet connection in my garage under a separate personal limited liability company name just to ensure there was absolute zero network overlap or shared IP routing. Eleanor reviewed the statutory framework again, outlining the exact legal strategy. Under California Labor Code Section 2870, any provision in an employment agreement which purports to require an employee to assign an invention created on personal time without company resources is legally unenforceable. Combined with federal patent statutes under Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 271, Nexacorp had zero legal standing to claim ownership over my independent work. Eleanor nodded in deep professional satisfaction. That is absolute perfection. We are not going to engage in childish shouting matches or file premature lawsuits. We are going to execute a precise, formal legal response that will make their general counsel freeze in absolute terror. We will present our position with overwhelming documentary evidence. By 3 p.m. on Monday afternoon, Eleanor and I were seated in Nexacorp's primary executive conference room on the top floor. The air conditioning was cranked down low, creating that distinct corporate chill designed to make departing employees feel vulnerable and exposed. Brad Preston sat at the head of the long glass table, flanked by Brenda Larson from Human Resources and their senior corporate legal advisor, a man wearing a three-piece suit who looked deeply bored. Brad appeared completely relaxed, casually spinning an expensive silver pen between his fingers. "Nate, Eleanor, thank you for coming in today," he began smoothly. "I assume we are here to finalize the exit documentation so everyone can move forward with their respective plans." Eleanor did not return his smile. She opened her leather briefcase, pulled out a formal legal notice stamped in red ink, and slid it directly across the polished glass table until it rested in front of Brad's coffee cup. "What exactly is this supposed to be?" Brad asked, his eyebrows knitting together in irritation as he picked up the document. "That is a formal notice of independent intellectual property ownership exemption," Eleanor declared, her voice dropping into a low, authoritative register that commanded absolute silence in the room. "Pursuant to paragraph 7 of Nate Vance's 2010 employment contract, as well as statutory protections under California Labor Code. Section 2870, my client is asserting exclusive, unencumbered personal ownership over all 14 core patents, algorithms, and firmware code bases registered under his name." Brenda Larson gasped softly, her eyes widening as she glanced nervously between the paper document and her digital tablet screen. Brad's face went completely rigid. His confident smirk vanished so quickly it looked as though someone had physically wiped it off his face with a damp cloth. "That is absolute nonsense," Brad snapped, his voice rising an octave in sudden anger. "Any technical work developed while employed at Nexacorp belongs entirely to Nexacorp. That paragraph is ancient boilerplate from a defunct corporate entity. Boilerplate or not, Mr. Preston, it remains a legally binding fully enforceable contract executed by the founding officers of this corporation, Eleanor countered coolly. Furthermore, under Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 271, any unauthorized commercialization, system integration, or licensing of my client's proprietary code in your upcoming flagship security hardware line will constitute deliberate, willful patent infringement. An absolute, suffocating silence descended upon the executive conference room like a heavy steel vault door shutting tight. The internal panic inside Nexacorp did not erupt immediately like a loud explosion. Rather, it spread silently and relentlessly like carbon monoxide through an old ventilation system. By Tuesday morning, internal executive chat channels were burning with frantic messages. The board of directors had convened an emergency closed-door session, and 3 external patent litigation partners were spotted hurrying into the legal wing carrying thick leather briefing binders. At 10:45 a.m., my former junior developer, Toby Miller, called my personal mobile phone. He sounded absolutely terrified, speaking in hushed, panicked whispers from a secluded stairwell inside the building. "Nate, what on earth did you do?" Toby asked, his voice shaking. "The entire engineering department is completely locked out of the core firmware repositories. Brad tried to force an emergency build deployment for the new biometric security deal, but the deployment server threw up a massive cryptographic validation error. I took a slow, deliberate sip of hot tea while sitting on my back porch, enjoying the quiet morning air." "Tell them to check the repository metadata, Toby." "What do you mean?" Toby stammered. "The repository source code is digitally signed with my personal private encryption key," I explained calmly. "Since Nexacorp does not own the underlying patent architecture under paragraph 7 of my contract, the security system is performing exactly as designed. It automatically refuses to compile unauthorized corporate builds without valid owner credentials." Before lunch arrived, Brenda Larson from Human Resources sent me a long email disguised as an urgent administrative check-in. She offered to double my severance package to $150,000 cash if I would agree to drop by the office before 5 p.m. to sign a simplified release form. Eleanor responded to her email within 12 minutes with a single devastating sentence: "My client's proprietary intellectual property is not for sale via administrative severance release." Then came the heavy corporate artillery. At 3 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon, Gordon Prescott, the managing partner of the private equity firm that owned majority shares in Nexacorp, called Eleanor's direct office line. Gordon was a ruthless 70-year-old corporate raider who had built an entire career on crushing small technology startups and absorbing their IP for pennies on the dollar. "Listen to me very carefully, Ms. Vance," Gordon growled over the speakerphone, his deep voice raspy from 50 years of cheap cigars. "Nexacorp has a $9.7 million hardware integration contract closing with a major federal contractor next Monday morning. If Nate Vance believes he can hold a multi-million-dollar corporation hostage over a 14-year-old footnote in a dusty offer letter, we will drag him through federal court until he is completely broke and destitute." Eleanor did not even pause her typing on her keyboard. "Mr. Prescott, you are certainly free to file whatever frivolous legal motions your firm deems appropriate. However, please be formally advised that along with our ownership assertion, we have already filed certified copies of Nate's notarized 2010 development logs directly with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Furthermore, if your firm attempts to ship hardware containing my client's patented algorithms on Monday, we will file for an immediate emergency federal injunction against your primary distribution partners." There was a long, excruciating, suffocating silence on the phone line. Gordon was a ruthless old fox, but he was not stupid. He understood immediately that an emergency federal injunction would not merely delay the $9.7 million deal. It would trigger a mandatory public legal audit by their institutional investors and instantly wipe out 70% of Nexacorp's market valuation. The risk of investor flight and public scandal was far too great for the board to ignore. A single public filing detailing patent theft would freeze their stock valuation and invite federal regulatory scrutiny. The venture capital group knew that a drawn-out legal fight would destroy the company before any trial date could be scheduled. What exactly does your client want to settle this matter? Gordon finally asked, his aggressive posture completely dissolving into cold, pragmatic calculation. He wants what is rightfully his, Eleanor replied evenly. Total formal recognition of personal IP ownership, complete control over technical licensing terms, and the immediate permanent removal of Brad Preston from any authority over his technical assets. By Thursday afternoon, the board of directors acted with brutal efficiency. Brad Preston was stripped of his operational authority, relieved of his executive duties, and placed on indefinite administrative leave. His glass corner office was locked by security, and his name was quietly scrubbed from the leadership page of the corporate website before the end of the business day. The arrogant young MBA who had walked into the building boasting about trimming fat had been completely severed by the exact contract clause he had refused to read. Friday morning arrived crisp, bright, and completely clear. I arrived at my new independent engineering office at 8:52 a.m. The office was located on the 4th floor of a restored brick building, featuring large floor-to-ceiling windows that looked directly across the street at Nexacorp's glass tower. In addition to my daily workspace setup, I had arranged a quiet meeting area where Eleanor and I could review the final executed documents. Our comprehensive legal strategy had paid off far beyond our initial expectations, laying a solid foundation for independent commercial operations moving forward. At 9:59 a.m., Eleanor sent a brief text message. The final licensing agreement has been executed by their board of directors. Pull the switch whenever you are ready. At exactly 10 a.m. sharp, I sat down at my dual-monitor workstation and executed a single terminal script. Across the street inside Nexacorp, the technical impact was instantaneous and total. Every single demonstration server, internal testing rig, and client integration portal running my firmware architecture froze instantly, displaying a high-contrast black screen with bold white text. System access suspended. Proprietary Ferdinand architecture licensed exclusively by Vance Applied Technologies LC. For oft licensing inquiries, contact legaladvancedtech.com. Within 47 seconds, high-resolution screenshots of the system lockout screen were published online by leading tech blogs and industry analysts. Nexacorp's public relations division scrambled to issue a rushed press release claiming routine maintenance, but the tech market saw right through the lie. By noon, their primary hardware distributor officially suspended all pending shipment orders until full legal proof of patent clearance was provided. At 2 p.m., Gordon Prescott and the interim chief executive officers signed the final binding licensing agreement drafted by Eleanor. Under the strict terms of the legally binding settlement, first, Vance Applied Technologies LLC was formally recognized as the sole, undisputed, and unencumbered owner of all 14 core technical patents and firmware codebases. Second, Nexacorp was granted a strictly non-transferable, non-exclusive 6-month emergency operating license at triple the standard industry royalty rate, resulting in an immediate 6-figure wire transfer directly into my company's bank account. Third, Nexacorp was contractually forbidden from attempting to reverse engineer, modify, or transfer any portion of the underlying source code without my explicit personal written authorization. Fourth, all legal fees and administrative costs incurred during the entire dispute were fully reimbursed by Nexacorp. I stood beside my 4th-floor window at 4 p.m., holding a warm mug of fresh dark roast coffee, watching the golden evening sunlight reflect off the glass building across the street. I watched as the remaining senior engineers walked out of the main entrance, holding their heads high, knowing that the toxic management structure that had threatened their careers had been thoroughly dismantled. The satisfaction of victory was not about petty revenge or personal malice. It was about establishing clear boundaries and protecting the integrity of honest technical labor. For 14 years, I had poured my intellect and heart into building systems that worked flawlessly, while executive suits treated engineers as disposable commodities. Now the power dynamics had permanently shifted back to where they belonged. In corporate America, Short-sighted executives like Brad Preston operate under the foolish delusion that true power belongs to whoever speaks loudest in the boardroom, holds the flashiest job title, or controls the quarterly budget presentation. They move fast, break things without understanding how they work, and naively assume that the quiet engineers, creators, and builders will simply bow their heads and accept whatever scraps they are thrown. But they consistently forget one fundamental truth of engineering and law. Complex systems are built on precise technical foundations, and legal contracts are written in binding ink. When you attempt to steal the life work of a man who spent 14 years documenting every single line of code he wrote under the quiet stars in his garage, you are not merely picking a fight with a former employee. You are picking a fistfight with the architect who built your entire reality. I took a long, satisfying sip of my coffee, turned back to my desk, and opened a fresh project directory for my next independent patent build. The fine print always wins in the end.